The effectiveness of the Atlantic Wall is still a hotly debated subject today. Some people point to Dieppe and argue it was deadly effective and that D-Day only succeeded by landing at the weakest point, and even then only by the skin of its teeth. Others argue the Atlantic Wall was simply a paper tiger, a propaganda tool. Regardless of where you stand on this debate, there's one place on the Atlantic Wall which is indisputably formidable, and that is the Channel Islands, specifically Alderney. This is Alderney, the jewel of the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's perfect island fortress. And we're going to have a look at, did it really deserve that title? Was it truly an impregnable perfect fortress? Could it have withstood any Allied assault that they threw at it? Let's have a look. Alderney is quite an unsuspecting island, being the smallest of the three Channel Islands. It lies just 8 miles off the coast of France, and is only 3 square miles wide. Being located very near Cherbourg gave Alderney far greater strategic significance than its small size would suggest. And in the 1850s and 60s, the Victorians turned it into a small island fortress. However, it was under the Germans that it really became a formidable fortress island. After the Germans captured the Channel Islands in 1940, they were convinced that the British would be desperate to try and retake the islands, which was actually a largely correct assumption. And also due to the high propaganda value of keeping the islands, they decided to invest heavily in fortifying them. And indeed 10% of all concrete used along the entire Atlantic Wall, stretching from Normandy to the Bay of Biscay, was used in the 3 Channel Islands, Guernsey, Jersey and Alderney. And Alderney especially was fortified far more than the other 2 islands, and it became the most heavily defended place in the world during World War II. And indeed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it also holds the highest concentration of bunkers per square mile of anywhere on the planet, which is quite a claim to fame. Before I dive into this, I owe a great deal of thanks to Trevor Davenport, whose books on Alderney and his work on the fortifications there have been immensely valuable to this video. And if you want to find out more about Alderney's defences, I'd highly recommend getting his book Festung Alderney, as it goes into great detail about all of the German defences, and indeed is where a lot of my information comes from. Under the German occupation, the 3 Channel Islands were turned into festungs, and Alderney specifically had very heavy defences, consisting of 5 heavy coastal artillery batteries, 4 of which were in open positions and could cover the seas all around the island and even reach the French coast. There were 22 anti-aircraft batteries, with 26 famed 88mm guns that could also depress and fire at naval targets, along with over 100 light flak guns. 12 strong points and 12 resistance nests, which were concentrations of bunkers surrounded with barbed wire and armed with anti-tank guns, mortars, flamethrowers, machine guns. 3 defence lines, or continuous lines of trenches snaking their way across the island. Over 30,000 landmines protecting the beaches and any open areas, and a small force of 12 to 15 FT-17 tanks to act as a mobile reserve. The garrison of Alderney, at 3,200 strong, would be able to defend the island with these weapons here. That's an incredible concentration of defences for only 3 square miles of island, and far more than anywhere in Normandy. All of these weapons, and the garrison controlling them, were protected by the infamous concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, and 86,000 cubic metres of concrete was used on Alderney. I believe that is the highest concentration of defences of anywhere along the Atlantic Wall, even the famed Pas de Calais region. Concentration of defences. Omaha Beach was famously a very well fortified position, and it was due to this that the infamous Bloody Omaha Beach happened. The US Army suffered 2,400 casualties on June 6th, and this was in part due to the initial bombardment being ineffective, but also due to the very effective fortifications the Germans had built, and the fact that the troops manning them were hardened divisions, not just static divisions. However, if we compare Omaha Beach to Alderney, it pales in comparison. I'm going to use Platzeline and Krabby Bay on the northwestern coast of the island, which was a planned landing site for an invasion of Alderney, and also Bray Beach in the middle of the island, and compare their weapons to Alderney. The beach defences at Omaha consisted of 8 pieces of 75mm or greater artillery, 18 anti-tank guns, 6 mortars, 35 Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, 85 machine guns and 6 tank turrets, across 8,000 metres of beach. A formidable set of defences that proved very effective on D-Day. Now to Alderney. Platzeline and Krabby Bay were defended by 2 105mm guns, 3 anti-tank guns, 4 tank turrets, 6 flak guns that could be depressed, 38 machine guns, 15 mortars, and indirect fire from 4 howitzers, all across 800 metres of beach, so only 10% of Omaha's length. Now if we scale that up, we get this set of defences, and compared to Omaha on the left, that's quite a notable increase. If we do the same for Bray Beach, the other main suggested landing site and the other big beach on Alderney's north coast, we get this many defences. This shows the insane concentration of defences that Alderney contained. It makes Omaha Beach look weak in comparison. And now this takes us on to our next question. Was this truly a perfect fortress? Would it have been possible to invade? Were there plans to invade? Could the Allies have captured it as they did Normandy, or would it have made Dieppe look like a holiday? Let's have a look. British plans to recapture the Channel Islands. Hitler's belief that the British would be desperate to recapture the Channel Islands was actually a very accurate reading of the British leadership at the time. Indeed, Churchill had been against surrendering the islands in the first place and strongly advocated for raids to recapture them. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was in charge of Combined Operations Headquarters, the unit tasked with planning and carrying out raids against occupied Europe, was firmly in favour of recapturing the Channel Islands and came up with 2 serious plans to try and take them back. One in conjunction with Operation Hadrian, and a later one called Operation Concertina, which was part of a wider operation called Operation Constellation to recapture all 3 Channel Islands. Operation Hadrian was an attempt to recapture the Cotentin Peninsula and the port of Cherbourg, but during the planning of this it was realised that the guns on Alderney, the large coastal artillery guns, would have been able to menace any shipping and landing craft trying to land on the peninsula, and so it was decided that the island had to be captured as part of this operation. The forces to be involved were huge. In air power alone there were to be 90 squadrons of fighters, 8 squadrons of fighter bombers, 20 squadrons of light and medium bombers, 5 tactical reconnaissance fighter squadrons, 12 night fighter squadrons, 1,116 aircraft for the airborne forces, and 518 gliders. In addition to this, every single operational squadron of the RAF's Bomber Command and at least 300 US heavy day bombers were to be employed. That totals at about 4,000 aircraft, or 1,300 aircraft per mile. For context, during D-Day in Normandy, there were only about 220 aircraft per mile of beach. There were to be 270 tons of bombs dropped indiscriminately across the island to try and soften up the defences before a landing. Operation Hadrian was later abandoned, but the plan to invade Alderney was saved and was adapted and renamed Operation Concertina to be carried out in late 1943 in conjunction with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Operation Concertina. The preliminary bombardment plan consisted of 500 to 600 heavy and medium bombers bombing every night in the 2 days running up to the operation, as well as US heavy day bombers bombing the island in the days beforehand. And on the night before the landing, there would be 3 waves of bombers with 10-minute intervals. However, one key flaw was that there would then be a 22-minute interval after all of the bombers had left, because Bomber Harris wanted them back before sunrise, but all of the landing craft had to wait until there was enough light to see the island, so there would have been this awkward 22-minute pause where all of the Germans who'd been hiding in their bunkers could rush out and man the defences just in time for the Allied troops to land. And this was a real flaw in the plan that was noticed, but nothing could be done about it. That's about 900 tons of bombs per night according to that plan, or between 2,300 and 4,500 tons of bombs in total. That's about 500 tons of bombs per square mile. For context, Dresden, when it was famously bombed into oblivion, was hit by about 490 tons of bombs per square mile. Alderney was to be bombed more heavily than Dresden. However, in 1943, only 16% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the target, which is a pitiful accuracy rate. And so it was for this reason that so many bombs were going to be used, as they realised most wouldn't actually even hit the island, let alone the targets on it. In addition to the 500 to 600 heavy and medium bombers in the nights before Operation Concertina, there were also to be 6 squadrons of light and medium bombers for diversionary bombing, 16 squadrons of US Air Force heavy bombers, 40 to 50 squadrons of fighters, 1 coastal command squadron for air-to-surface radar, and 1 squadron of coastal strike aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs to deal with enemy light naval vessels, along with at least 1 PRU aircraft, or photo reconnaissance. That's between 1,200 and 1,400 aircraft to be used all in one night to invade a 3 square mile island. And that's almost double the concentration of aircraft that were to be used during the Normandy landings. The plan for the invasion was relatively simple and would involve a small task force removing the booms to the main harbour, and then the first wave landing at nautical twilight AM, 22 minutes after the last air support had left. The second and third waves would immediately follow up as soon as the beaches are cleared, and there would be a floating reserve of 2 battalions available, about 1,800 men. And during this there'd be as much close air support as possible from fighters and fighter bombers. The troops were planned to land on Saline, Krabi and Bray Bay, all along the north coast of the island. The naval power for this operation was as such. Overall, that's 73 vessels, and this was the landing force. That's about 2,400 infantry for the initial assault, with about 4,300 troops in total. However, to assault an island with a garrison of 3,200, that would not have been sufficient. Basic tactics dictate you need at least a 3-to-1 ratio when attacking to guarantee a 50% chance of success, which isn't brilliant, and they were attacking with a 4-to-3 ratio against them, so they really did not have enough troops for this invasion. It's worth noting that Allied planners made a note of and understood that unless they could destroy all of the fortifications on the island with the preliminary bombardment and the bombing, particularly the coastal artillery, then the landing was doomed to fail, as they could simply pick off any landing craft coming in. It was also noted that for any airborne landings, one of the snags was that the island is about a mile wide from the northwest side, north, east side and southwest side. The prevailing wind, of course, is across that, and in those days you jumped out of an aircraft with 20 men, one after the other, and the mathematics of it are that if you do this and everything goes perfectly, you drop 2 or 3 men in the sea, either before you start or at the end of the run. Another problem that I've previously mentioned was the 22-minute gap after the aerial bombardment had finished but before the landings would actually commence, which would have been a real flaw in the plan. A final concern that the planners had was that the granite composition of the island would be resistant to the bombing that would be carried out, and many of the defences would be undamaged. What chance would this attack have had? In order to answer this quite complicated question, we have to look at 3 aspects. First, the fortifications of the island, which we have done. Secondly, the plan of attack, which we've just finished. And thirdly, let's look at similar plans and similar attacks that happened elsewhere and how did they do? How successful were they? And then after all that, we can try and make a judgment on whether the plan to invade Alderney would have been successful in any way, or if it would have been a failure. How effective was the Atlantic Wall elsewhere? General Lieutenant Rudolf Schmetzer was ordered to make a report on the effectiveness of the Atlantic Wall throughout 1944, and it makes for some very interesting reading. An example is given of a personnel shelter with 2-metre thick concrete withstanding 2 direct hits from 500 kilo bombs, but a third hit collapsing the ceiling and killing half the occupants. However, 3 direct hits on a 10 by 15 metre area from 500 kilo bombs was considered unusual, and it successfully withstood 2 direct hits with no damage. Curiously, there's also a case of a 250 kilo bomb landing just outside the embrasure of a gun bunker, and the pressure killing all of the crew, but leaving the gun relatively undamaged. He also noted an example of a coastal artillery battery, which had been under what he considered the heaviest bombing attacks, to a degree probably unparalleled in the entire Atlantic Wall area. After 2.5 weeks of intense bombardment, he found only 25% casualties. All shelters for personnel, ammunition and command had held up flawlessly. There were 6 guns, 4 in open positions and 2 enclosed in bunkers. One of the open guns was still intact and fully functional, whilst the other 3 were lightly damaged and were back in action 2 to 4 days later. However, the 2 guns in the bunkers were heavily damaged to the point where only their barrels remained serviceable, and the gun mounts were damaged beyond repair, along with the concrete casemate surrounding it. He concludes that guns in open positions tended to survive better than casemated guns, due to superior camouflage and being a smaller target. Anything short of a direct hit would at worst only slightly damage the gun for a couple of days, whilst casemated artillery was far more susceptible to being knocked out. Furthermore, the ability to fire the open guns in any direction gives far more effectiveness and flexibility to the battery. On Utah Beach, 2nd Lieutenant Arthur Jank, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was stationed at WN 104, or Resistance Nest 104, during D-Day, in the middle of Utah Beach, and he described how twin-engine bombers targeted his position, which churned up their trenches, destroyed a 75mm anti-tank gun, and damaged an 88mm. 2 ammunition bunkers blew up, and machine gun nests were buried by sand. However, the personnel shelters held up very well. A second wave of rockets and cannon fire destroyed 2 50mm anti-tank gun bunkers, and an artillery duel then ensued between the Allied warships and the remaining 2 guns, one 77mm field gun and another 88. Both were soon knocked out. The heavy naval bombardment from battleships and destroyers levelled trenches, destroyed barbed wire, blew up minefields, drowned bunkers in sand, and disabled the remote control flamethrower, along with the Goliath trapped mines. 500 tons of bombs were dropped across the 7 strongpoints of Utah Beach, so we can assume that this position received minimum 70 tons of bombs, plus the naval bombardment, which seems to have been the real killer. The position was completely annihilated, and when the US troops made it there, they found an old French tank and some sporadic rifle fire being the only resistance. Resistance Nest 104 had been reduced to rubble. In this example, the Atlantic Wall didn't hold up at all against the onslaught it faced, although it's worth noting that the personnel bunkers did, and most of the defenders survived the bombardment, despite the destruction it seemed to cause. In contrast, on Omaha Beach, the bombardment was largely ineffective due to heavy fog cover. This meant the bombers dropped their bombs too far inland to avoid the risk of hitting their own troops, and the naval bombardment struggled to accurately hit German positions. This resulted in most of the German defensive positions on Omaha remaining intact, resulting in the infamous Bloody Omaha. Despite the failure on Omaha, the naval bombardment was devastatingly effective across Utah, Gold, Juneau and Sword beaches, and was a major factor in the success of these landings. The German positions proved unable to withstand the direct fire from battleships and destroyers. The aerial bombing had mixed results. In some places, such as Point du Hoc and Utah, bombers managed to flatten the area and neutralise many of the defences. However, the preliminary aerial bombardment was largely ineffective. 1,300 Lancasters and Halifaxes largely failed to neutralise their 10 artillery batteries that were their targets on D-Day, whilst 1,400 B-24 and B-17 bombers also failed to destroy most of their 45 positions. Over 13,000 bombs were dropped on the German defences across Normandy during D-Day, yet very few German casualties resulted from this aerial attack. So to conclude, it appears that heavy bombing was somewhat effective, if inaccurate, against bunkers, but it was the naval bombardment that was the real killer, and that really did the damage and could cripple a defensive position. However, despite this, the personnel bunkers generally held up very well, meaning the occupants of said defensive position would often survive the attack, even if their weapon positions were destroyed. Now, before coming to a conclusion, I'd like to briefly talk about an interesting event that happened in late 1944. HMS Rodney shells Alderney. On the 12th of August, Battery Blucher of Alderney was firing on US troops on the Cotentin Peninsula, west of Cherbourg, and so HMS Rodney was ordered to bombard it to stop it from firing. Across 2.5 hours, it fired 75 high explosive shells at the battery. It damaged only one of the 4 guns of the battery, which was back in action 2 months later, and it only took that long because a spare part had to be flown there from Germany. 2 Germans were killed before the rest fled to their underground shelters, where they remained untouched for the rest of the bombardment. 40 shells landed within 600 feet of the target, guided by photo-reconnaissance Spitfires, which is really quite accurate at 17 kilometres away, but little real damage was done to the defences. So, could an operation to try and recapture Alderney have succeeded? The short answer is no. The long answer is almost certainly not. Alderney had an incredible plethora of defences, all specifically designed to prevent a landing from happening in the first place. Anti-tank walls and mined beaches with obstacles to stop landing craft, all swept by machine gun fire and anti-tank guns, and mortars covering every stretch of beach. All of this meant any landing would have been very, very challenging. And the defences make Omaha Beach look weak. I think that says enough about how formidable they are. Another key problem would have been any sort of aerial attack, such as paratroopers or gliders, would have really struggled due to the small size of the island. And had they landed, they would have been so spread out that they wouldn't have been able to regroup, because the distance needed to regroup, you'd keep running into German positions before you could find your fellow paratroopers. So they would have been little more than a nuisance rather than an effective distraction. Another key problem is that even if a landing was successful and a beach was managed to be captured, you couldn't break out like you could on the mainland. You couldn't go 100 metres without running into another resistance nest or strongly defended German position. And this was a key problem with it. Alderney, every inch of land was covered by weapons, was defended. There was no dead ground. There was no, oh, we've got through their defences, we can now get into the open farmland and advance a bit before we reach any real German forces. You were in a constant dead zones, constantly overlooked by machine guns, blocked by barbed wire and minefields, covered by mortars. I mean, the entire island was a killing zone. So even if a landing was initially successful, they made a beachhead, they broke out from said beachhead. Where do you go? You go into the island and meet more defences. So that just couldn't have worked. Another key problem with the planned landings as well was the lack of any serious naval bombardment. As we saw, a heavy naval bombardment was what was crucial to the success of D-Day. And on Omaha, where it was lacking, it was really to the detriment of the soldiers on the ground, to the point where the landings almost failed. And a large reason that they rallied and were successful was that a set of destroyers came in very close to the beach and fired at point blank range into the hills and into the bunkers to try and subdue the German fire. And as we've seen when HMS Rodney shelled Alderney, it did little real damage, and that's a heavy battleship. The naval force for invading Alderney consisted of 8 destroyers and 1 monitor, which is really quite a light force given that their guns are not particularly heavy calibre. And if, as the planners feared, some of those naval artillery and coastal artillery batteries on Alderney survived, they could wreak havoc amongst those destroyers who were trying to give fire support. And in the best case scenario, where the destroyers managed to damage or knock out or at least incapacitate many of the German defensive positions along the beaches, as we've just discussed, there's still the rest of the island, which is also just as lethal. The aerial bombardment planned for the island was very heavy and very well thought out, and would have definitely left Alderney looking like a moonscape. But whether or not that would have successfully destroyed the defensive positions and incapacitated the defenders is quite hard to say. And looking at other reports on the Atlantic War, which we did earlier, we can conclude that many of the weapons would have been destroyed or at least lightly damaged by this bombardment, but almost all of the troops would have survived, if shell-shocked, but physically unscathed. And that 22-minute pause after the aerial bombardment had ceased, where the only bombardment was going to be from 8 destroyers and a monitor, meant almost all of the German garrison of Alderney would be able to come out of their underground shelters and get into their fighting positions, man their machine guns, man the artillery, and it would be just in time for all of the troops coming in their little landing crafts, and it would have been a bloodbath. Another key problem was the timing. Firstly, this was planned to be in conjunction with Operation Husky, which was ultimately why the operation was scrapped, because all landing craft and support forces were needed for Operation Husky. They couldn't spare anything to invade Alderney. But the reason I bring this up is because in 1943, the Allies didn't have any specialist landing equipment, and chiefly landing tanks. Now I'm talking about the tanks that made D-Day successful, the amazing Sherman DDs, Churchill AVREs with fascines and bobbins, the Sherman Crabs to get rid of the minefields, these kind of things that really they were what made D-Day so successful, the ability to have tanks on the beach to protect the infantry, to give fire support, to destroy the bunkers and the anti-tank walls. And Omaha's lack of such vehicles, largely due to the fact that they sunk on the way in, was another reason why it was such a bloodbath. There were no tanks on the beach to support the infantry. Now, in 1943, the Allies didn't have any of these specialist vehicles. They were in development, but none of them were ready. And during Operation Husky, none of them were used, which thankfully they were needed as the Husky landings were relatively unopposed. But for these landings in Alderney, not having any of these specialist vehicles would have been a real problem, because the troops would have been landing basically on their own, would have to charge up an open stretch of mined beach and would then be met with an anti-tank wall. Meanwhile, anti-tank guns, field guns, mortars, machine guns, even portable flamethrowers would be covering the beach, and it would have been a massacre. Now, had this operation been carried out in 1944, after or even in conjunction with D-Day, it would have had a higher chance of success. And to be honest, had they done it in 1945, or at least late 1944, after the D-Day landings had been successful, this is the only time I can see it having any chance of success, due to the fact that they'd carried out the Normandy landings. They had the experience, they had the landing craft, they had the specialist tanks, they knew exactly how to carry out an amphibious operation. However, in 1943, it had little to no chance of success, and even if they'd done it later, it would have been a very, very close-cut thing, due to just how formidable German defences really were. And the final problem, which I mentioned earlier, were the numbers. Invading with 2,400 infantry, with only 4,300 troops overall, is really not enough against a 3,200 strong garrison. You need at least a 3-to-1 ratio, and that was a 4-to-3 ratio against the invaders. So it really would have just been a bloodbath. Let's say everything had gone perfectly. They'd managed to capture one of the beaches, they managed to break out. They just simply wouldn't have had the men to be able to take the whole island, because the initial troops landing were outnumbered by the garrison, and almost all of the garrison were fighting men, whether they were Luftwaffe manning the anti-aircraft guns, infantry or artillerymen, they were all fighting soldiers. So the invasion plan had pretty much no chance of success. So Alderney really does deserve the title of a perfect fortress, one that was so formidable it was never actually attacked. It was a victim of its own success, it was never even tested. But it was a good thing that it was never tested, because the planned attacks were completely insufficient and would have been absolute bloodbaths for the troops involved. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this, and drop a comment down below letting me know what you think. If you've got any friends who you think would be interested in this video, please share it with them, as it will really help the channel. Thank you.